Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second panel for the day, how to build effective engineering teams for the future. It's a topic very interesting, and I'm excited to have an awesome panel today to talk about some interesting questions. So let's start with introductions. John, could you tell us a little bit about yourself to the audience?
Sure. John Hansen. I'm a senior technical recruiter at Postmates. I lead the hiring for the robotics team. I've also worked at Amazon, Microsoft, Northrop Grumman. I specialize in basically hiring engineers across pretty much any discipline, mechanical, electrical, software.
Nice to have you. Madhu?
Hey, I'm Madhu Vora. I work as the Director of Engineering for Nutanix. I work in the infrastructure and security spaces. I have a background in working on other companies like VMware, NetApp before that, Symantec/Veritas before that. Excited to be here. So thank you, Sachin, for giving us the opportunity to speak to this forum of people. Looking forward.
Thank you. Watson?
Sure. So my name is Watson. I am the Director of Engineering at Salesforce. So I lead a couple of the machine learning teams in Salesforce Einstein, which is our customer-facing B2B ML products. I've been with the company for 4 years. I'm excited to interact in this forum with the HackerEarth community. And I hope everyone's staying safe, whether it's the pandemic or the fires in the West Coast. Stay safe, you all.
Thanks, Watson. And lastly, Isaac?
Hi, I'm Isaac Hepworth. I'm based in Boulder, Colorado. I work for Microsoft and lead a team of about 100 PMs and engineers in Azure, the cloud business. Prior to Microsoft, I've been at Twitter, Stripe, and Google a couple of times over the last dozen years or so.
Yeah, welcome panelists, and thanks a lot for taking our time for the discussion today. I'm sure the audience is going to enjoy some of the things that we're going to talk about. So let's start with, let's dive in. Let's start with the first question. And this is for you, Isaac and Madhu, and maybe we can start with you, Isaac. What, according to you, is the most important trait that you look for when hiring engineers today?
I think really, I would say capability for learning and intellectual curiosity goes along with that. I mean, I think if, I've only been at Microsoft 18 months, but even in that time, the cloud industry moves very quickly. We're doing different things and have different priorities now than we did when I first joined the company. And I think that there's a need for continual learning and adaptability on the job. The things which we'll be doing in my team in 2 years' time are likely to be characteristically different from the kinds of things we're doing today, and may require a different approach, maybe require a different focus. And really, I'm looking for folks' ability to be adaptable and continually learn. And I think intellectual curiosity is a big part of that. Folks who have within them an inherent curiosity and a desire to learn and explore and develop new skills, develop new capabilities. I see a lot of that on my team. It's an incredibly valuable trait.
Got it. So what you're saying is learnability is the key for you because obviously skills are changing so rapidly. Makes a lot of sense. What about you, Madhu? What do you look for?
Well, I second what Isaac just said. I think he touched on all of the basic points. When you said new age engineers, it's the world around us is changing so fast. I mean, COVID times of everything else has proved that we need to be ready for the unknown all the time. I'm looking for people who are hungry to learn. I'm looking for people who are very willing to roll up the sleeves and dive into whatever's required to do. Looking for good engineers, basically. There are certain set of skill sets that are very suitable for the job. But when I look at engineers, particularly the new age engineers, the engineers in the first few years of their tenure at this point, it's their willingness and desire to learn.
Got it. So that's a very relevant point, and kind of wanting to unpack it a little bit more. And either Isaac or Madhu, you could talk about it. How do you kind of, assess for that skill? Like learnability, picking that up is not that straightforward, right? Like, are there certain things that you've done in the past that have helped you identify folks who are, who have that learnability capability?
So, yeah, so I can start with what I look at. I look at people who want to. So basically, and COVID times of all times has made it very interesting because most things are remote. So I look at people who are listening to you well. I look at people who are trying to understand the problem that you're trying to solve. I asked you A and you give me an answer to B. And that's fine because we are all remote. But from my side, I continue expanding more on what I'm looking for. And from your side, you continue understanding more on what the ask is. And as long as we can bridge the gap between A and B, I think we are doing a credible job. I think we are doing a decent job. And then the curiosity about when I'm explaining, what my role is, or when I'm explaining what my group does or what my company does, there are certain things that I look for. Did you come prepared a little bit? Did you take a few seconds to look around and see what Nutanix is, what the competitions are, what products we offer, what your thoughts are around some of that? Did you try to at least pick up basic stuff from that? That's one thing. And the second thing is, did you ask those kind of questions to me? Doesn't matter what role I'm hiring for. Hey, I see VMware as a big competitor for Nutanix and VMware is coming with X. What's your story around that? Or I read your story around that is this. Is that correct? Is my understanding right? Some of basic, simple things like that, which shows that they're leaning in, which shows that they are looking and they're excited and they want to know more and learn more and be a part of the solution. There's simplest of the things like that encourage and excite me.
I think, I'd like to echo just a couple of key points which really resonated with me that Madhu just said. I think, doing one's homework and, showing up for an interview with some opinions and some knowledge, a recognition that someone's, looked me up, I'm on Twitter, I'm on LinkedIn, you can look at me. So someone who's done some research about the company, even the group that I work in, certainly shows that curiosity and initiative around learning. And then the other thing which Madhu said was a desire to understand the problem, and so zooming out and understanding what are we actually trying to achieve here, what's the core business result we're trying to achieve, rather than focusing very, very narrowly on the technology or the stack or the tools that we're using. A keenness to understand the bigger picture can certainly come across at interview and is a very positive sign, I would say.
That makes so much sense. So the next one is for you, John. Obviously, COVID has changed a lot of things for all of us. Speaking from a recruiter's perspective, how has your hiring or screening process changed, if at all, during the COVID times?
Yeah, well, initially it was shifting to video calls using coding platforms and different platforms to do whiteboarding over video chat. So that was the initial change that needed to be made. Now we're running into a lot of bandwidth issues in residential telecommunication services as kids are going back to school and they're on Zoom meeting all day. They're taking up Wi-Fi. So a lot of the video and even like online coding tests that we were using are timing out. And so we're trying to figure out, how do you overcome that as time goes on.
Got it. And from a hiring manager perspective, Watson, has there been any change in your hiring or interviewing style during COVID?
Yeah, so as with everyone else, everything is virtual today. But I must admit that I was a little skeptical initially when we went completely remote, how all of this is going to pan out. But I started to sense opportunity, and one of the groups who sort of inspired me was our Future Force recruiting program within Salesforce. So when we had finished hiring our summer interns for this year, no one knew that it was going to be a remote program, and a whole lot of people were anxious, especially the interns, because being physically present is a crucial part of their experience. But I was pretty amazed how well they pulled it off, and having witnessed that, I was even more encouraged as to what you can accomplish, even in recruitment when everything is remote. So for me, I have observed that you have access to a much larger pool of candidates, so that's a good thing. The outreach programs have changed as well. So we often go to university recruiting for new grads, especially, and I've done this in the past. I've gone to a couple of universities, but now there are conferences that even university career fairs have become virtual. So I was recently at this conference called Tapia Conference, which is an opportunity for a whole lot of university students to interact with potential prospective employers. It is a little awkward, I must admit, initially when you go and sit in a room like a virtual table and you start interacting with candidates through chat or through these Hangouts. But once you get used to it, you start sensing the amazing potential that is out there. So for example, in this Tapia conference, in a 3-hour boot shift slot that I was in, I spoke to a whole lot of candidates from all across US, whether it's California, Georgia, or Texas. I even spoke to candidates in Vietnam. It's pretty amazing how much you can accomplish. So I think, yes, the process has changed, but I sense opportunity in it.
So that's a very, very pertinent point, Watson, and I was kind of alluding to it earlier in the conversation earlier in the day, that while COVID has posed its own challenges, there are opportunities, just like you said, right? And widening our sourcing funnel and looking beyond the conventional channels, I think, is one of those opportunities that all of us need to latch onto. So kind of, doubling down on that a little bit more, there are certain changes that, we're seeing because of COVID in our process. How much of it do you think is going to continue being there, even if, all of this goes back to normal, if there is any normal after this?
That is a great question. I suppose you wanted me to answer to that first. Yeah, so I first have to admit how much I miss the old times, right? Like the hallway conversations that we've all used to having, the lunchtime banters that I have with my team, or generally the vibe that you get out of an office. Everybody talks about the Salesforce Tower, which gives you this amazing bird's eye view of the city of San Francisco. So we all miss that. And we all are not completely sure how the world is going to look 2-3 years from now as far as work is concerned. There are certainly a lot of positives as well that have come out of this. So for me personally, for instance, I don't have to take a 3-hour commute back and forth in any given day, sitting on a shuttle, going to work and coming back. So it has, certainly increased our productivity. But it is unclear to us, what the new world will look like when this dissipates. Certainly, there seems to be like there's a potential where you don't perhaps have to show up in the office every single day. Maybe you can get that 2 days a week so that you can get all these interactions that you thrive on, whether those whiteboarding sessions or team bonding sessions, those might still happen in person. Whereas when you want to get work done and you want to put your heads down and stay focused, you could continue to accomplish that remotely. And I think, as I had alluded to in my previous response, there is an opportunity again. COVID, I may have quoted this earlier, is a leveler in some sense. Because these things are going virtual, you're not only like reducing the greenhouse footprint on the planet. You don't have to take a transatlantic flight a couple of times a year to attend these conferences. And because these conferences are virtual, you have access to a bigger pool. Things don't get sold out in the first 2 minutes, which often happens with the NeurIPS conference, for example. So those things are all great. And I've known scenarios where in the past, whether it's a technology conference or it's a like a paper presentation conference, like NeurIPS or what have you, people from some countries have traditionally not been able to attend those because they didn't get the immigration process cleared. So now they can still present in these venues by saying wherever they are, whether it's in some remote part of India or Africa. So I think it's a great leveler, and I would certainly love to see this possibility continue to exist while we still somehow cater to the social interactions we all crave for.
That's a brilliant point. So Madhu, would you like to add to that? What according to you, are the things that we would continue being with even after COVID subsides?
I think COVID times has taught us a lot. These are tough times, but we have learned. So I agree with everything that Watson said. We have explored. We have learned. It was hard at the beginning, but we have explored. We have expanded. We have learned new ways. Interviewing people from remote places, that's great. I mean, I was just talking, and I'm hiring right now, and I was just talking to my recruiter earlier this morning, and similar thoughts. If you can't find the right resumes in the local area, do you expand out? And the thought at that time, there was a time when we would say, no, the entire team's local, we would want to keep it local because there are a lot of hallway conversations. While I miss that too, at this point, my thought is I want good resumes. That's it. I want good candidates. And some of these things are here to stay. I mean, many of the tech companies have already said we'll probably be work from home till mid next year, or maybe next 2-3 years. It's going to be flexible. Even if we were staying local, just reiterating what Watson just said, 3 hours worth of commute every day. If we go back to office today, I still wonder how many of us would do that. And that's not just the Bay Area, that's also India, that's also other places, right? So people will continue to leverage this new learned work from home knowledge for some more time. And even if it's not full time, they'll go to work 2 days, 3 days, they'll work from home 2 days, 3 days. So it's going to be a decent balance of both of those. So I think some of the changes that we have made, or some of the things that we have learned, are here to stay, at least for the next foreseeable future, in my mind.
Makes sense. I think I was reading you got to spend about a few months doing something and it gets into you. So we are already past that barrier now. It's like
exactly
from home. So I'm sure all of us are. Yeah. Like you wanted to add to that.
I think it was interesting, just kind of building on what Watson and Madhu said. It's been interesting for me to see how the leveling effect still has a situational component. So I'm based in Boulder, and before COVID hit, I was essentially the one remote worker on my team. Almost all of my team were in Redmond on Microsoft headquarters campus, and now everyone's remote, and in some senses, yes, that's leveling. We're all now working from home, and we're all very remote. But it's almost to my advantage now, because I'm the one with a home office. I'm the one with a nice standing desk and dual monitors and everything, because I work from home for a living. I was already set up for this. Whereas I got folks on my team who are doing Teams calls from their closet. They got kids bouncing around the house, and I think that there is a big situational component still to just the viability for many people of working at home. Do they have a good setup? Do they have a 2-bedroom house with 3 kids and a spouse who's working full time at home as well, and no real area? What's their bandwidth like? And yeah, certainly the child, the online school component, I think that's a huge differentiating factor in the experience here. So certainly folks on my team, the last few weeks has been back to school in Washington State, and it's had a marked effect on how folks are feeling and the pressure folks are feeling on the team, and if they have young kids at home. And so I think that there's still a differentiated experience, even if at a high level you can look at, well, everyone's the same, we're all remote now. There is still a differentiated or situational component to the experience.
Right, that makes so much sense. So moving on to the next question, and this one's for you, John. Recruiting and engineering are kind of partners. You got to work together to ensure we're building a high quality team. But then at the end of the day, we operate differently. So how have you collaborated with engineering teams in the past? Anything that's, any tips that have worked for you?
Yeah, so I view my role as supporting managers to help them fill their positions. So I bring strategies, market insights, technology, tools, and we build out a plan and a strategy. We build out metrics to be able to understand if we're being successful, and really just partner throughout the process. I know sometimes it feels like there's a push and a pull between recruiters and managers, but really we're working towards the same goals. So when you approach it like that and you keep that in mind, over time you can break down the barriers between the two functions and really work together on a strategy that you can both agree on and execute.
Got it. And Isaac, what's been your take on kind of collaborating with recruiting teams, and anything that's worked well for you in the past?
I think a couple of things. I think the first one is, recruiters that I work with, I really want to ensure that they understand the business that I'm in and how my team operates and the types of business results we're trying to achieve, and having that background. And so, I treat, cross-functional partners like recruiting, like HR as part of my virtual team. And I really very much want to bring them in and have that openness of, you have them develop a really good idea of how we operate and what we're trying to get done. And then I think the other thing, which often getting started with, recruiting for a new position or new sets of positions, is really very quickly trying to calibrate with the recruiting what it is I'm looking for, and having a really high bandwidth feedback channel. In the very, very beginning, I like to see a whole bunch of resumes come through and do a bunch of screening myself, and explain my screening decisions and explain my thinking. At which point, then hopefully I'll get well calibrated with a recruiter and enable the recruiter to do screening and really get ahead of stuff like that. But I think having that calibration and level set between the hiring manager and the recruiter about what the business needs are, what the team is trying to achieve, and then also what kind of screening criteria matter to a manager. I certainly I've worked with recruiters who have made assumptions like a degree is required, and commonly we'll post jobs where a degree is required. Actually, if you look closely, I don't care if people have a degree or not, and there's plenty of high performers on my team today who didn't graduate college, and that's just fine. And so I think it's an easy criterion to stake. Hey, you've got to have a degree, and maybe you'll get a few false positives that way. But actually, I would rather cast the net much broader than that and say that's not a requirement for most of the jobs that I'm hiring for. And it's kind of calibrating around these common assumptions about how we screen things in and out. You can get to a calibrated situation very, very quickly, but it's a matter of like I say, a high bandwidth communication channel between recruiter and hiring manager, basically.
Got it. Yeah, go ahead, John.
Yeah, so I think Isaac really hit on what's important here. It's getting it set up properly from the very beginning as far as calibration, making sure the recruiter understands the business. I think on the recruiter's end, it would be informing Isaac like what they're seeing in the market, what they're seeing as far as offers and companies that are being recruited from heavily, how his team stacks up to the market. Really, as you partner on that, you can build a great team pretty quickly, but it's going to take a lot of upfront work.
Right.
Well, what's interesting for me as well is just kind of an appreciation of the difference between sourcing and recruiting. And I've worked in companies where they have a rich sourcing function. There are people who are dedicated to continuously trawling, LinkedIn or the market or GitHub, whatever it may be, and reaching out to people. It's been interesting for me to note that Microsoft does not do that very much, and so I certainly get my inbox outreach from all kinds of companies, but I don't think I've ever had a proactive outreach from Microsoft, and now I work there, but there I think recognizing that there is this difference between sourcing and recruiting, and certainly I've had to recalibrate my expectations at Microsoft and had taken a lot more of the sourcing function within me and my team, and then kind of having a handoff point to a recruiter at some point. But what I think there is this critical function in understanding the market, understanding which companies you can find the talent at, which regions you'll find the talent at, the secular shifts in hiring patterns and so on. I really value that as a hiring manager, and that's incredibly important.
Got it. So if I got it correctly, Isaac, you said that today your team is kind of doing some bit of sourcing yourself.
Yes.
When you say your team, I'm assuming your engineering team. So do they feel they're doing something that they don't necessarily have to?
I mean, we feel very strongly about recruiting the right talent into the team, and so I think the engineers at first had a small bit of resentment about having to participate quite so heavily in the sourcing process, but actually there's a realization that brings empowerment in a sense that there's an engineering on my team who identified someone who'd done some great conference talks, who'd written some really good articles, he read a book that she'd written, he went to her website and literally reached out to her on LinkedIn and said, hey, I'm really interested in your work. I think it fits really, really well with what we're looking for. And that person's going to be joining us in a few weeks. And that's, a selection which an engineer on my team has actively gone out and identified an individual in the industry who he thought would be a really good fit for the team, and built a relationship and recruited her in. And I think that there is an empowerment that comes with that once you get past this initial hurdle of, why am I having to do this? Why is it me having to look at LinkedIn or go find people? But it's nice to have the team. I tell my team that we have collective ownership of our destiny as a team, and I think that having the team involved in sourcing is a part of that. Is a part of determining the folks that we want to hire.
I think you've set up something great in your team, because I haven't seen this that often. So kudos to you. So kind of, doubling down on the whole point about alignment between recruiters and hiring managers. And, Watson, this is for you. How do obviously recruiters have certain goals. At the end of the day, both the teams want the best hire to be in. But, sometimes in the midst of pressures to kind of fill out the roles, things, the alignment could kind of diverge. So are there things that you've done in the past to create stronger alignment between engineering and recruiting teams?
Yeah, so I would second what John said, in that hiring managers and recruiters are actually partners. And I don't think recruiting starts when you have an open position. So I always believe in the philosophy of always be hiring. So to me, it's not just when I have an opening that I'm trying to fill that I go to a recruiter. So I'm always in contact with them, whether it is for the university outreach programs or going to conferences which we haven't gone to before, things of that nature. As far as for specific roles, what we generally do is partner with the recruiter to understand or help them understand the outcomes that I'm trying to expect out of a particular role. And at Salesforce, this is not that hard, in that every one of us has a document called the V2 MOM, which many might have heard about. Essentially, it's vision, values, methods, obstacles, and measures statement. So everyone has a good understanding of what their roadmap is going to look like a year into the future. So based on my own V2 MOM document, I'll know, okay, what are some methods that I'm hoping to accomplish for which I need this role to help me achieve that objective. So once we define those outcomes, then I work with the recruiter in defining what are some competencies that I need for that role, essentially. And then, the hiring manager works with the recruiter and the team to build what we call as an interview committee, essentially. Like, what are some areas that we are looking to, test this candidate on, while also giving them a good enough glimpse of the nature of the work that they will be doing in this team, because it goes both ways, right? So yeah, we set up that committee, and then we also have sources. We also have hiring coordinators who help streamline this process. So when we get closer to the interview, or let's say we've completed the interview, the hiring the recruiter partners with us to help us identify what are some accommodations that we need to consider. Anything, whether this candidate is interested in relocation, do they have some special immigration scenarios that we need to take care of? And more importantly, they help us provide that perspective as far as the competitive landscape is concerned. Who are the companies that we are trying to compete with for a certain kind of talent? How quickly should we rush to grab them, and who are the other companies that they are talking to in the same space, so on and so forth. So I think recruiters bring in a lot of valuable experience. Having been in the front lines, they are the ones who are talking most to these candidates. So I certainly value their opinion, and they are equal partners in making sure that we hire the right talent.
Right. That makes so much sense. So I think you were, you kind of mentioned, you talked about how it's very important to create that alignment between the recruiting team and the engineering team, and how you spend a lot of time upfront making sure that the recruiters understand the role that you're hiring for. But obviously, it's a process, right? Recruiting would have, like Watson said, you're recruiting all the time. And then for a specific role, typically the process could span anything between, say, a month to 3-4 months. So how do you, is there any communication cadence that has worked for you in the past in terms of, making sure that there is alignment?
I think, sorry, was that a question to me?
Yeah. And Watson could add to that as well.
So I think, having a weekly check-in, it depends on the scale of the hiring, right? Right now, the last 3 months or so, I've actively been doing a lot of recruiting. I've added about 20 people to my team, and 20 engineers into my team in the last 3 months. And I think, it's been important for me to, have a regular cadence of check-ins, but have a sense of the pipeline as well. And so I have a sense at any point, like, okay, here are the number of open positions we have, here are the number of, folks who come in the front door, here's the number of those screened, in process, and get a sense of the overall shape of the funnel, overall sticking points in the funnel, what does our accept rate look like, and, are our offers competitive, and really understanding the the metrics, which is something you can do when you're hiring at the scale of dozens. It's harder to do that when you're hiring just one or two. But echoing what Watson said about always be hiring. Like I always want to, ideally, I'd like to have a warm pipeline of people which I can kind of source from as I get additional resources and additional headcount to hire against. But I think having a weekly check-in between hiring manager and recruiter around where are we, what are we seeing, what are our metrics looking like, what's even the end-to-end latency through this funnel, like how quickly are we getting people? Because if it is a competitive environment, and if you can't get from someone seeing your job description online, getting them through the loops and getting them to an offer, if you don't move quick enough, you're going to lose talent. And so making sure that you have an eye on the end-to-end latency through this pipeline, as well as the overall efficacy of the funnel as well.
Got it. Watson, you wanted to add something?
No, he actually stole the words from my mouth. So great. Yeah.
So, Madhu, moving to you, you've kind of worked at various organizations over the years. So, this is kind of not just from your perspective at Nutanix, but otherwise as well in the past. When you've sat on the table with the recruiters, how often have you been, there's been a discordance or you've seen alignment? Like, how often does that happen that you have like perfect alignment with the recruiting team?
So I'd be lying if I would say, it's always perfectly aligned and, we are on this. It does not happen like that. I mean, communication is the key. I think both Isaac and Watson covered it really well. I have been, and I try to keep a steady pipeline of candidates as well, hiring or not. Hiring does not start from the day you open up the rec. So Watson hit it on the head correctly. You always need to know. You always need to look ahead. You always need to have a plan ready around, if I have a need, here are the, this is how I'm going to proceed, and this is, what I'm looking for. So we do not have a formal V2 mom. I actually really like that idea. Thank you for sharing that. But there is always a rough mental map, right? And we try to keep our, every time we talk about future-looking roadmap or things like that, we take gauge on what are we missing. Do we have the right set of skills that we are looking for? Do we want kernel capabilities? Do we want UI capabilities? What are we looking for? What do we have? So we keep taking stock of this. And so I meet with my recruiters pretty regularly as well. Now, if I'm actively hiring, it's usually once a week and maybe more on Slack or emails or things like that. If I'm not actively hiring, we occasionally meet up, which could be once every 2 weeks, once every 3 weeks, doesn't matter. But more frequently than once a month. So I do meet with my recruiters, just syncing up, picking stock of market. So when we get to the table on discussing a particular rec, we know that we are not starting from square one. We have something already built up. And I think this helps keep the alignment going a lot better. Now, in my current situation, I have multiple recs that we are hiring for. And it gets very tricky because, your rec, you have multiple recs, you have multiple candidates, and you have multiple different types of skills that you're trying to hire. So in times like today, it's very good. I think it's one of the best practices that you should stay in very close sync with your recruiting team. And it's like Watson was saying, it's not one person, it's a team.
Right.
And it's always a team effort, right? And me and my recruiting team, we are like equally responsible for bringing the right candidates, because if we do not see the right set of resumes, we do not hire right. It starts from there. And we do not see the right set of resumes because we are not putting the right requirements forth. Right? So it's very, very important from where I see it is to stay in very close touch with your recruiting team and making sure that you understand the market from their perspective and they understand the internals from yours.
Got it. Makes so much sense. John, what's your perspective as a recruiter? Where have you seen discordance whenever working with? Because like Madhu said, we would all be lying if we say there's perfect alignment. So let's talk about where all do we see discordance.
Yeah, I mean, there's discordance when you're not talking, about the same things, when your goals are misaligned. So, really the approach that I take to make sure that I'm aligned with the goals of the organization. I basically am working with two levels of leadership. So engineering leaders, like the engineering leaders on this call, they want to know what the recruiting pipeline looks like. They want to talk about, how their team needs to be shaped, what levels they need. They want to talk about diversity goals. They want to know how their individual managers are doing, how their, interviewer workload is. All those different kinds of things are important to them. So, I'll talk to them on that level. Regular reporting or meetings, whatever works best for them. Then there's the actual engineering manager. So working with them to build out a strategy, realistic plans. Oftentimes the misalignment there is they think if they open a position today, they should have a new hire in 2 weeks. That would be fantastic. But a lot of times this may be their first time hiring, or maybe they haven't hired in 2 years, so they don't understand what the competitive landscape looks like. So building out a strategy with them and a reporting mechanism, keeping them involved, those are the ways to bridge that gap. And oftentimes, recruiters are really busy and they don't have time to do that, or an engineering leader is unavailable to, give feedback, or they may seem like they're not paying attention. So that's where some of those rifts start to go. But really, if you coach it like we were talking about earlier, from a teamwork perspective, and you understand the needs of what the engineering leaders need and what the actual engineering managers need, you can build out the types of reporting and communications to where you take those misalignments, turn them into alignments, and then you can execute.
So I think the key, like for everything else when it comes to collaboration, is communication, communication, and communication. You do that well, and there'll obviously be alignment. So shifting gears from collaboration between recruiting teams and hiring teams, let's talk a little bit about the process. And I think when it comes to the whole assessment and interviewing process, tech is notorious for being extremely lengthy. And I'm a software developer myself. I've gone through those hoops, multiple rounds of interviews, multiple kind of assessments, and which obviously is needed given the complexity of the roles. So Isaac, let's start with you. What's your take on the most challenging part of either the assessment or interviewing process? And if there was something that you would like to change, what would that be?
So I think, the most challenging part is, aligning the assessment to the actual needs of the role, right? And because, hey, yeah, you may have someone that can, invert a binary tree on a whiteboard, but that's another key part of the role. As it happens, there are a vast number of things that are more important than the ability to do that. And so aligning the assessment criteria to criteria which actually speaks to expected success in the role is really key. And one of the companies I've worked at that I thought did a really, really good job of this was Stripe. And Stripe would, they've got some great blog posts about their interview process and how they think about it. When I interviewed there, they gave me a homework challenge that was very closely representative to, the kinds of problems that I'd be solving in my role if I joined Stripe. And I'll be honest with you, I kind of resented having to spend hours doing this homework, but actually having done it, I thought it was a great way for me to demonstrate expertise on a real world problem that would have meaning to Stripe, and was a great way then, having done the homework, to have meaningful discussions with interviewers about how I'd approached the problem, my thinking about it, and it was a real problem that was of interest to the business. I think for engineers, I'm not sure if they still do it, but certainly for a few years when I was there, they would have engineers come in and try and debug something in Stripe's actual code. Like, come in, hey, here's a thing. How would you go about investigating this bug, or how would you go about investigating implementing this feature? Bring your own laptop, bring your favorite dev tools, dive in and show us what you've got. And I think that the other thing I really appreciated that Stripe did was really setting expectations up front and being incredibly open and transparent about what the interview process would look like. Because I think it shouldn't be the case that if you know someone at Stripe and they'll tell you what the interview is going to go like, that insider knowledge shouldn't be an advantage, and it shouldn't be insider knowledge. Like, everyone walking into an interview should know what they're going to be assessed on, how many people they're going to meet, the types of questions they're going to get asked. And recently, I've seen, I've been at Google twice, and the first time around was 2005, 2006, and there was a lot of kind of mystery about the interview process and what it would be like. But the second time around, I joined 10 years later. I was really pleasantly surprised to see, I got an email from a recruiter saying, here's exactly what the interview is going to look like. Here's the type of people you're going to meet with. Even here's some reading material. Here's a book that people have found useful. Go read this and that. People have found this useful to prepare for interviews, and just kind of giving folks the best shot at success in the interview, I think went a long, long way. And as part of the candid experience, it really put me at ease. And so I think it's those two things about aligning the assessment criteria with criteria for actual job success, and then giving people their best shot at success by being open about all of the meta aspects of the process, which is it shouldn't be a secret, and I think it's to a company's disadvantage if they keep it a secret and they test people by surprising them. It doesn't feel like a very natural, helpful part of the process.
Got it. So I'm going to ask you something on behalf of all the recruiters, and we get this question asked a lot. You spoke about a fairly intensive assessment that you went through at Stripe. I'm sure you must have spent, at least 3-4 hours trying to build out the solution, if not more. And engineers, particularly senior engineers, are kind of averse to spending that time, typically in the beginning of the process. So what would your, what would you tell engineers to kind of, show them the value of a process like this? And I'm sure a lot of recruiters struggle with this. So
I think it's part of demonstrating or saying this is how we've built an amazing team. Stripe has an amazing team, and we've done it by being very careful about how we hire. And this is the process we use, and these are the results that we've seen from it, and this is why we think it's important. I think when I was going through the process at Stripe, I was interviewing for a PM position. They didn't have any PMs at the time, and so I was being interviewed by people who even questioned the notion that Stripe should have a PM function, period, which was interesting. But the thing that I found that made a difference to me being assigned that homework is being given time to do it. I have a family here, I have kids, I have personal commitments, I have domestic commitments, and so the idea that at 2 days' notice I can carve 6 hours out of a weekend to concentrate on this project, it wasn't realistic. And I told them that, and I said, look, I'm going to need more time, and they gave me more time, and they were very understanding. But I think a recognition that everyone has a busy life, and yes, you may want this job really, really badly, but you've got to be realistic about the time commitments you can expect from people, particularly at short notice. But I mean, ideally, you can make the case for this process, through your reputation at being a good team, at hiring very well. And I think Stripe has a well-deserved and good reputation for having a really killer team. I had a terrific time working there, and I think that I was willing to put in the effort because the opportunity merited it.
Got it. So John, coming to you. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I look at the interviewing process as me basically having 3 customers. So I've got the candidate, I've got the engineering manager, and I have the interviewer. So when I open a position, I always go through the interview process with the engineering manager. We lay it out in a very clear format and are very purposeful about each stage. That's one of the things that helps us so that we don't interview endlessly, because I think there is, maybe a tendency for engineering managers to want one more data point. Let's have them take a coding test. Well, let's have this engineer talk to them. But when you lay it out and say, okay, so we're asking this candidate to spend 7 hours total interviewing with us throughout the process. Here's what we want out of this step, out of this step, out of this step. This is what we want from each of your interviewers. Here are the interviewers for each step. That helps the engineering manager see, wow, from the candidate's perspective, that's a lot of time. Also, that's a lot of time for my team to spend talking to this person. So that's really helpful. That also cascades down to the interviewers, because then either myself or the manager can go to them and say, here's what we expect from you, here's what you're evaluating for, this is the feedback we'd like. And then finally, if I've got all that set up, then I can tell the candidate on the very first phone call I have with them what to expect throughout the process. And that makes for a really nice transition between steps. And then if someone's going to do a final round or an on-site interview with us, I always have a phone call with them. It only usually takes 5 to 10 minutes to say, this person's going to ask you about this. You can prepare for this in this interview. This interviewer likes to hear about this type of experience. And the candidate's quite happy, and I get a lot more offers out of it that way. So really, I mean, at the end of the day, we're setting everybody up for success if we do it right from the very beginning.
I love that perspective, John. Really love it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. And we've all heard stories where where candidates apply and they never get timely communication, and nobody likes that experience, right? And today's day and age, candidate experience is so important. So, shifting gears a little bit, and we've all been going through the remote working environment, and of course that has had impact on our productivities. I would like to say engineering productivity has actually gone up. At least that's what we've seen within HackerEarth. But I would like to get perspective of the panel here. So Madhu, how's been remote working for your team, and how you've been? One is productivity, getting things done that were already probably in the pipeline, and then there's the other element of innovation. There are, you need to do brainstorming, you need to do whiteboarding. How have you worked around those aspects in COVID?
I don't think remote working has stopped us from either innovating or being productive or delivering. I think we are doing more. I think the biggest challenge that we have in times like today is finding that right balance, because I think the work and life boundaries have blended in so well that work's life and life's work. Yeah. So productivity wise, I think we are doing pretty okay from my team's perspective. And in fact, I get a very similar sentiment, not just across my company, but across other my network that I talk to. Right. So I get a very similar feeling that people are more productive, people are more uh, plugged into work, probably 24/7 at this point. People are also, so innovations going on, whiteboard sessions, even though we are missing a whiteboard, there are a lot more, communications and conversations and discussions, be it on tools like Slack, be it on tools like Zoom. So there is a lot of Zoom. But I think all of those are going just great in these times. Where I see challenges in particular is finding that right balance. Kids are in school, you still need to send them for breakfast, but you lost the support. You lost the support where you could just order in something, or drive them, or school breakfast is available. And that's just one example. I mean, there were times a few months ago when daycares were closed, when help was not available, right? So things like those, so people are losing some of the support as well. So I think the challenges that we have is to finding the right balance for each individual. And I would be, I would strongly want to encourage everyone to not compare it with the life that you had before pre-COVID times, because the societal structure was a little different.
Yeah.
Um, Saying that, you particularly asked about productivity, and I think I see a lot of engagement from my team. At the same time, I see some burnout too. And what I do as a manager for the team is I keep reminding them that every individual needs to find their own work-life balance. What I also do is, as a manager of managers, I encourage my managers to reach out to their teams and pass on the same message, and at the same time internalize that message themselves too. For example, if I am passionate about something and I have a question right now that I want to answer, and if I want to go in and say, "Hey, I need an answer for this now," that now in this world can mean that yes, there might be a few delays. It's okay to wait another hour or so for the answer. It's okay to say, "Hey, this is my lunch slot and I cannot take a meeting right now because I have plans." It's okay for some of those. Productivity still continues, innovation still continues. You're still holding on to everything, probably a lot more. But finding that right balance is where the key is. And I think finding that right balance is also something that's going to encourage us, because this is, if you are always on, it's an unsustainable model. If you
Right.
were to continue with the same amount of productivity and the same amount of innovation, unless we find that balance, we won't be able to sustain this model right now.
Got it. So what you're basically saying is we have to be very conscious about creating that balance. Otherwise, one can be just swept away with, the current scenario of working remotely.
Right. What I'm trying to say is if we don't find that balance, we will see these sine waves where we will see peaks in productivity and then dips because people are burnt out and sick days and all of that. And then at some point, it would be like, hey, we haven't done anything. So you'll see a peak of productivity again. So instead of avoiding that sine wave, if we find a balance, we'll probably see a more steady straight line going across us.
What's your take on this, Watson? What have you
Well,
seen?
yeah, like Madhu, my bigger concern is more about burnout than productivity, because productivity has shot through the roof.
Yeah.
A good example is, our whole summer internship program, as with many other companies, was completely remote. And these are students from an undergrad program or a grad program who have an assigned mentor, but in the past, they sit next to someone who's more experienced, get their environment set up. But now we're talking about laptops that were shipped to them. They had to get set up remotely. All questions had to be answered remotely. And I was a little skeptical, I didn't know how well it would go. But I have been amazed by how much a lot of these young people have been able to accomplish in 12 weeks, all while working remotely. So productivity is certainly through the roof. But like Madhu said, we need to be able to make it sustainable. So you can't continue working like this. And one of the things that we do is we have these team agreements. We create this document as a team where we all agree that, okay, what are some norms that we will follow? For example, you cannot force ping someone after 6 p.m. on a Slack. You can't mention them. And likewise, if you send an email over weekend, it is understood that they don't have to get back to you until Monday. So, some of those discipline as a team and as an individual is important to avoid this burnout. But as far as innovation is concerned, granted, we don't have access to whiteboarding and all those brainstorming sessions that we used to have. But on the positive side, the tooling has improved so much to support a lot of these things happening remotely. So we leverage a lot of those. And I also care about the hallway conversations that we are missing, or the social events that we are missing in these remote times. So we've had some icebreaker sessions, and sometimes we just huddle together as a team and just talk. There's no agenda. There's no fun event plan. It's just, getting together as a team and checking in like, hey, how's it going? So those are helping. One thing I do want to acknowledge is that, when we say that productivity has shot through the roof, it, as Madhu was saying again, is different for different people. Certainly for people who have young toddlers at home, or if you're a caregiver of somebody, perhaps working from home is not an ideal setup for you. And as a manager, and my advice is generally to increase your empathy, because you have to cut some slack for people in times like this. You cannot, again, as Madhu said, hold yourself and your team to the same standards as you did before, because everyone's situation is different. So a little bit of empathy, extra empathy in times like this goes a long way in making sure that your team is as productive and as innovative as you were before COVID.
I love both of those answers. I really did. And some things which stood out for me was always Madhu saying, taking an individualistic approach, recognizing that needs of individuals differ. And I think, my boss had, his phrase, which I really liked, was, we're all going through the same storm, but we're in different boats. And I really liked that as a metaphor for the situation, and the need to have empathy and an individualized approach. And then, again, I heard from both about sustainability. When I talk to my team about, I will take, short-term deadline misses in exchange for long-term team health any day of the week. My concern is making sure that the team is healthy today, in a quarter's time, at the end of the fiscal year, next year, and we're in this for the long game. And so I care a lot about team health in the long term, and that absolutely about sustainability of workload. And so I thought that both Madhu and Hudson touched on those key points really, really well.
Yeah, totally agreed. Very, very relevant point that it's a different journey for each one of us, and we have to be mindful and conscious of that. So kind of, adding on to that, of course, there's this aspect of working remotely, and the whole thing about working remotely magnifies for new joiners, because earlier you would get them, you would meet them at office, and so many things would happen, on its own. But now you've got to be very conscious about the whole onboarding process. Have there been things that you've done, Isaac, to kind of make sure that new joiners still have the same experience and they're onboarded the right way? And you said you hired 20 people in the last month. So I'm sure you.
Yeah, and I think going into that, recognizing, we had a couple of concerns looking at the scale of hiring we were doing, and number one was, gosh, how many interview hours is this going to take to land 20 hires? And looking at how we spread those out across the team. But the other thing was, how do we onboard folks at scale, and make, and orient them effectively, make them productive, make them feel good about, being a part of the team. I think there are a few things. And I think part of it is building feedback loops into the process. And so having periods where, you'll go 30 days in, how are you doing, fill in the survey, in previous jobs, I would write a document 30 days into my new job of things that I wish I'd known on day one. I know them now on day 30, but this would have been really useful for me to know on the day I joined. And encouraging people that I hire to add to that document, and you collect a kind of compendium of useful things. And I think that the other thing is, particularly with everyone being remote, is make sure we're writing stuff down. And so we should have the objectives of the team written down, the scope of the team, the mission, where do you find this, like making sure that our wiki is up to date, making sure that we have good documentation. And again, in terms of feedback loops, asking folks who will come on and read through an onboarding guide and go through an onboarding process. Anytime you get stuck or there's something not clear, go edit that document and make it better for the next person. Like, it shouldn't be the case that we keep having new joiners hitting the same hiccups in the onboarding process again and again. I want to make sure we have the right feedback loops in place so that every person who joins can benefit from all the people who joined just ahead of them. But I think I think it was Watson who mentioned just the whole thing with shipping laptops now. Like, just IT support is a different game now. And the fact that on my day one at Microsoft, I was up in Redmond. They gave me a laptop. Everyone can make sure I log in. I got my group policy applied, all my certificates and smart cards and second factors and everything are set up. And if they're not, there's IT people standing right there who can help me. And it's a different world now where you might even be joining and your laptop's not arrived yet, and you've got to find something to do for the first 3 days until your kit gets here. But I think it's monitoring and feedback. It's making sure that we have these feedback loops that we're continuously improving, and we deliberately insert this continual learning organization. We get better. Every person we onboard has a better experience than the previous person. But certainly, I would say hardware and IT support has been the biggest challenge, frankly, and particularly in a large enterprise where things like policy and smart cards and chips and second factors and all this kind of stuff are just such a big part of everything, and laptops are locked down and secure machines for accessing production systems and so on. It's a fairly complicated process, but I think to Microsoft's credit, they've gotten really good at it, because this isn't just my group that's doing this. This is like the thousands of people Microsoft is hiring that all going through this, the remote new employee onboarding.
Right. And John, what has you've done at Postmates to kind of make sure that new joiners have the same experience as before?
Yeah, so I'll talk specifically about the robotics team, because you can imagine onboarding a new electrical engineer in this environment is not terribly easy. So, we've done a lot to allow, to continue to build robots by hand, and bringing someone new into that environment. We've got a lot of processes and things already in place, but, we still maintain 6 feet of distance at all times. We have sanitary protocols. What it's boiled down to is we let people take a lot of things home that they probably wouldn't have been able to take home in the past. Everything from very expensive, boards to even full robots to test out in their neighborhood or at home. So that's been a big change for us. But we've been able to get through it. And I'm hiring mechanical and electrical engineers right now, and coming up with the plans for how do we get them into the shop and get them the right training. We also work with manufacturers, so having to go into their facilities and maintain our company standards, and someone else's facility has been very interesting. But it's a good problem to work through. If you look at what we do, food delivery, thinking about sanitation protocols and all those different kinds of things, I think we're actually going to have a much better set of sanitation protocols and social distancing measures going forward that I think will be beneficial even after this period of COVID is over.
Got it. Makes so much sense. So guys, we're almost top of the hour. So I was thinking, is it okay if we take a couple of questions from the audience?
Sure.
Yeah. So Watson, this one for you. With so many people getting hired during COVID times, we'll soon have teams where most people haven't had a chance to meet their colleagues in person. Do you think it would impact collaboration and team spirit in general? Maybe not now, but sometime down the line, because we don't have the same relationships.
Yeah, I've pondered about this question. I often ask myself, is my team more productive than they were before? because of the fact that we knew each other in a physical office setting, is that what is driving it? What would it look like if every one of us joined remote? And the answer is actually pretty. I'm leaning towards no, in that the interns that I again gave you as an example, they've only seen remote. None of them have ever interacted with the team in person before. And likewise, I've had a couple of new hires in my team who started only after we all went into lockdown. But that does not change how well I interact with them or how well I get to know them. So I'm not concerned that you cannot develop these bonds in virtual interactions. A good example is the open source community, right? Thousands of open source developers contribute to these projects in GitHub and whatnot, and a lot of them have never seen each other. It doesn't mean that they don't produce these amazing results. But I would say that eventually, at some point, it'll be great if, even in a remote world, people get together, a couple of days a year to have some fun events where you develop those bonding. And I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah. There's another question, and this is more about, again, kind of touching upon onboarding that we were talking about very recently, is like, how do you get a new person to get themselves unblocked? Particularly in the beginning, when you don't have those, you don't really know people, you're generally hesitant. And if they're at office, then one could just walk up to them and those conversations happen naturally. But now they have to drop in an email or ping someone. So has any one of you done anything to kind of get those, conversations happening, particularly in the first few days of the employee? You could go ahead, Madhu, and then Watson could chime in.
Yeah, so I mean, we have, and exactly like what Watson was saying, I've hired people who have joined after we went shelter in place, all of us, right? So I have, and quite a few, all different types of locations. What we try to do is we try to organize things like happy hours where people can just hang out and not talk about work, just talk about, things that are interesting and relevant to each one of us. Maybe movies, right? Or kids or beer, whatever it works. So it's more like just hang out, and it's 1 hour. There is no pressure on anyone to join, but I have seen people join from US, from India, from Australia, from Palestine. I've seen people join from everywhere. So it's amazing to see that everybody wants to connect in this way. So that's one thing that we have done. The other thing that I do in particular is with my new hires, I try to set up one-on-ones, regardless of which area of team they join. I try to set up one-on-ones to get to know them better, for them to get to know me better. So if they have any question, they reach out to me. And I do it with the knowledge of their managers. Like, for example, if one of my direct reports hired somebody, I would let them know that I'm going to talk to your new hire. And most of the times, everybody is very open to that because, again, if we can't meet a person in person, like if we can meet somebody physically, then the second best alternative is to be able to talk. And I think that helps a lot. That helps build trust at both ends of the side. I trust the engineer that we just hired. The engineer trusts me enough to come up to me and say, hey, we should do this and we should not do this. Simple things like that, right? So I think those are the two things that have worked really well with us. We've been talking about introducing things like, we can do team lunches, like virtual Zoom-based team lunches. But there are so many Zoom meetings that I am really hesitant to put anymore.
Zoom fatigue.
Yeah. There's Zoom fatigue everywhere.
Right.
Yeah. Right. But we do happy hours.
Got
it. And trust me, we have done a happy hour at 7 a.m. at one time. So we can include people from all over the world. So,
So just to quickly add to it, so we have a formal process where we have an assigned onboarding buddy, as they're called, for every new hire. So the onboarding buddy meets with the new hire every morning. So there's a morning check-in. Additionally, I'm sure a lot of tech companies follow Agile. So you have stand-up meetings where they can raise their concerns. But the onboarding buddy is their primary point of contact while they're getting to know the company. And all means of communication, Slack, Hangouts, whatever you have, are all open. And that's part of the team agreement as well, especially when you're remote. You agree that you will be responsive, especially to a new hire, because you're eventually going to enable them to become productive, which means they'll be bothering you less. So there's a vested interest there.
Got it. And I know we are over time, but I'll just take one last question and we'll keep it very brief. And this is a little bit contentious, and I know you guys can't speak on behalf of your organizations, but I just want to know your perspective. So a lot of companies are going remote. What that means is, and we all know the status of visas in the US. It's becoming harder and harder for people from outside to come in. What do you think about hiring remote folks from outside the US? Do you think that could work? And it's again, I'll call it an individual opinion. I know you can't speak behalf of the organization. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, so we're hiring a lot from Canada right now. I know that's not terribly remote by most standards, but we're less and less fixed on a location. So where in the past we wanted people in San Francisco or Los Angeles, we're now looking to Canada and saying, there's no reason why someone in Toronto can be just as effective as someone who lives in the Bay Area. So we're looking that way. I think you still have a lot of, tax and immigration. You have intellectual export, regulations that you have to work off of if you're, working on certain technologies. But I think generally speaking, we're becoming less and less location specific in general across the recruiting industry at this point.
Got it. Go ahead, Isaac.
I think, so I have folks on my team across the US, but then also India, Shanghai, Dublin. I think that the one thing that I'm super conscious of when hiring is really time zone proximity rather than physical proximity, because that's a big factor when it comes to collaboration. Like how much kind of the working hours do people overlap, and I'm particularly wary of hiring ones or twos in distant time zones that are on their own. I think if you can establish some centers with a critical mass, so I have a critical mass on the Shanghai time zone, I have a critical mass around West Coast US time zone, and it makes a big difference. But it's very difficult for me to entertain the idea of one person on the team joining from some far-flung time zone where they're absolutely on their own and they have very little overlap with the rest of the team. And that's just operationally, it's really difficult to absorb individuals who are on far-flung time zones. But achieving some critical mass around kind of time zones has worked for me, and certainly I feel it's a competitive advantage to be able to hire irrespective of location. Like just no doubt at all. And Microsoft, has enough local subsidiaries and enough legal support and everything that we can make these things happen much easier than smaller companies. But certainly for me as a manager, it's time zone rather than geography, which plays the biggest factor.
Yeah, and just to second Isaac, I think for large companies like Microsoft or Salesforce, that is not a problem. Like, in Salesforce, we have huge operations in India, in Israel. And like the old saying goes, the sun never sets in the British Empire. Likewise, in some of these companies, the sun does not set. There's always someone who's awake and who's working. But it's probably for smaller companies, it's a problem that still needs to be solved for in the future, especially given the scenario we are in currently.
Saying that, I think if COVID has taught us one thing, it's that location has become irrelevant, at least for jobs that are particularly in the high-tech world.
Right. Yeah. So it's a more, like you said, the time zone overlap is a lot more important than being co-located. Makes so much sense, guys. I've absolutely enjoyed hosting the panel with you. Some really insightful conversations. Thanks a lot for making time for the discussion today. And I'm sure the audience would have also loved the conversation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.